This is Yulia, and here we are again. Welcome to all the rebels and revolutionaries. Last time, we focused on multiple Iranian coups and uprisings that took place around the turn of the 20th century, while tracking the most important political events in the country's history up until the early 1950s. Today, we will explore an incredibly interesting, yet devastatingly sad story of a revolution, or a coup to be precise. This coup was orchestrated by the CIA and MI6 against arguably the first democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammed Mossadegh. This coup deprived the Iranian people of a powerful figure who could have steered this country onto a very different course. Please join me to watch Operation Ajax in action. As an American citizen, I found that my research for this episode was painful, as it presented the actions of the US government leaders in less than a perfect light. Yet, I believe that true patriotism is not just flag-waving. Patriotism involves a willingness to get a deeper understanding of historical choices made by those who shaped the events in question. In some cases, this understanding brings pain and disappointment, which hopefully reduces the chances of us repeating the same mistakes in the future. As you may recall, we left the story of the Iranian revolutionary turbulence in the spring of 1951, with the appointment of Mohammed Mossadegh as the Prime Minister of Iran. The new administration went to work immediately, producing several impressive social reforms, such as the introduction of unemployment compensation and sick and disability pay. On May 1st of 1951, however, Mossadegh did something that truly shocked the world. He nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, canceling all its oil concessions to Britain. On the surface, his logic was highly intuitive and fair. Oil was an Iranian resource, and yet Britain benefited from it almost exclusively, leaving Iranians nothing but crumbs. Every nation, according to Mossadegh, has a right to control its own destiny and its own natural resources. An outdated and utterly unfair document signed by the former and rather corrupt Iranian rulers should not stop Iran from rectifying this injustice. Fair enough, right? Well, the British thought differently. True, they did control most of the oil industry and enjoyed a lion's share of its profits, but before the British created that very industry, Iran simply did not have one. Yes, the oil was an Iranian resource, but Britain argued Iran had it buried in the ground for centuries. British workers labored for decades to build cities, roads, and the entire oil infrastructure in one of the most inhospitable regions in the world. Britain also took the risk of getting nothing out of this endeavor. As such, Brits reasoned the bulk of the resulting profits should go to those who invested the money and effort and took on the risk. This perceived injustice angered Mossadegh greatly, and his rising popularity naturally culminated in the nationalization of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Now, it's easy to conclude that Mossadegh was a modern Robin Hood. He appears to be very well-intended, very complex, and even a bit quirky character. He would often break into uncontrollable tears while speaking to the Majlis, and was, in general, a very emotional person. And from the very start of his premiership, he directed his passion towards Britain. In response, Britain made sure that Iran could not sell a drop of their oil on the world market, thus depriving the country of a vital source of revenue. Good old Winston Churchill just could not shake off his colonial demeanor and was headed on a collision course with Iran. Lacking the support of the international community and not wishing to provoke a Soviet intervention in northern Iran, Churchill chose to avoid the takeover of Abadan oil fields, preferring to focus on covert operations instead. British intelligence officers posing as diplomats attempted to influence the course of events in Iran. After several of these incidents, Mossadegh closed the British embassy in Tehran. This meant that Britain lost any means to subvert Mossadegh's activity from the inside. In desperation, they turned to the Americans. They appealed directly to President Truman to help British allies overthrow Mohammed Mossadegh. Churchill greatly miscalculated. Churchill was talking to the wrong man. Truman was deeply troubled by British colonial aspirations and their heavy-handed approach. Predictably, Truman wanted to have nothing to do with this cooperation. But the Iron Curtain had already descended on the European continent, and many of the US political leaders saw the world in strikingly black and white terms. East versus West, communist versus free world. This left no room for subtleties. The history of any revolution does have its turning point, and for Britain, this turning point came in 1953, when Dwight Eisenhower became the US president. His Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and his brother, Alan Dulles, who happened to be appointed as the new CIA director in Ike's incoming administration, saw Iran as an imminent target for Soviet takeover. And Eisenhower swiftly authorized CIA involvement in the anti-Mossadegh coup, which became known in the US as Operation Ajax. This sensitive operation was entrusted by the Dulles brothers to a long-term CIA operative and true expert of covert operation, Kermit Roosevelt. And if the last name sounds familiar to you, he was indeed a grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt. In late July of 1953, he was smuggled into Iran and began organizing a coup. Well, what does it really mean to organize a coup? See, by 1953, the British oil embargo brought the Iranian economy to its knees, and the resulting political turmoil began to take a major toll on Mossadegh's popularity and political power. He was increasingly blamed for the economic and political crisis, and his national front was falling apart. Knowing all that, Roosevelt began an aggressive, multifaceted campaign. He bribed anti-Mossadegh media outlets who would print mostly fabricated propaganda pieces. He gained the trust of mid-level military officers who could be relied on when the actual coup would take place, and on mullahs, who would denounce the prime minister as being against Islam. Above all, Roosevelt focused his efforts, greatly enhanced by the US taxpayers' dollars, towards the destruction of the National Front coalition. This was the very coalition that brought Mossadegh to power. One by one, members of this coalition denounced the prime minister, with many exiting the coalition altogether. Roosevelt's spy craft culminated in a brilliant yet disturbing campaign of public disorder, using a rather limited budget by today's standards. The campaign was meant to convince Iranians that the prime minister had lost his grip on power. Roosevelt managed to recruit several street gang leaders, including the most famous and flamboyant thug in Tehran, by the flattering name of Shabam the Brainless. Shabam's assignment was as simple as it was genius and effective. Gather a crowd of equally brainless and well-compensated thugs and rampage the streets, firing guns at mosques, proclaiming their undying love for Mossadegh and communism. Roosevelt then hired another mob to attack Shabam's mob, to create the impression of total chaos. As a result, many ordinary citizens began to associate Mossadegh with chaos, communism, and disorder. The hardest part was to convert all the covertness into a legitimate transfer of power away from Mossadegh. It is still not clear to me if the Shah of Iran had a right to dispose of a democratically elected prime minister, but Roosevelt clearly thought so, and he spent countless evenings commuting to the royal palace in a backseat of a taxicab, wrapped in blankets to avoid detection. Over the course of several meetings, Roosevelt was able to persuade the highly indecisive Shah to issue the order to depose his prime minister. In a brilliant stroke of spy genius, Roosevelt offered proof that he represented the highest authority in the Western world. He did this by promising that the BBC would end the day by saying it is exactly midnight, as opposed to their usual it is now midnight statement. Only God himself, or Winston Churchill, could authorize this change. Knowing that the real power players were backing Roosevelt's efforts, the Shah agreed. Now, the future of the Iranian constitutional rule depended on timing, on plots and counterplots, and on which column of soldiers would reach the Prime Minister's house first. In the evening of August 15, 1953, Colonel Nasiri was sent to deliver the firman with instructions to dismiss Mossadegh. and arrest him if he refused to leave. He arrived too late and was himself arrested by troops loyal to the Prime Minister as the plotters approached Mossadegh's house. It was like a good old James Bond movie. Mossadegh's chief of staff, General Riahi, who was also supposed to be arrested by the plotters, escaped right before they came. These plots were foiled because Mossadegh was informed about the planned coup in advance and was able to take measures to protect the government. As soon as it became clear that the coup had failed, the Shah flew to Baghdad and then on to Rome. Back in Tehran, Mossadegh and his supporters assumed that all this plotting was done by the Shah, which was reasonable since the Shah was nowhere to be found. The Prime Minister had no idea that most of his recent troubles were mainly due to the actions of one person, Kermit Roosevelt. If this information were to become public, Roosevelt would have been in deep trouble. And that is why the CIA leadership ordered him to get the heck out of Iran, in order that he successfully ignored. Giving up on his assignment was not something the master spy was willing to do. Roosevelt thought that he could complete his mission impossible, and he was right. He intensified the anti-Mossadegh propaganda campaign that reached a peak level on August 19th of 1953, when the city entered a dark time of complete chaos. Competing mobs were battling each other, while battling government troops, who in turn were fighting with military units, who switched their allegiance to the anti-Mossadegh camp. Mossadegh's house was on fire. The Prime Minister fled, and the coup had finally succeeded. The Shah quickly returned to Iran, and Roosevelt came back to Washington. Since he was viewed as the ultimate government overthrowing machine, he was offered the enticing possibility to risk his life again while overthrowing a government in Guatemala. Shockingly, he decided against this tempting career move. The Shah's return brought back some stability, but at the price of a much more tyrannic government, supported by the newly established security apparatus, the deeply feared Savak, whose main goal was suppression of any opposition to the Shah's rule. From the American point of view, especially those in the CIA, the coup was a complete success. But this success came at the tremendous cost of suffocating the democracy in Iran, at the expense of an increasingly powerful Shah. Instead of seeking societal improvements, similar to Mossadegh's regime, the Shah spent most of the oil revenues he controlled on modernization of his armed forces. But the opposition to the Shah's rule grew, despite the brutal methods of the Savak. And so did the pressure within Iranian society, which found its release in a much more fundamental branch of Islam. The Shah's increasingly repressive regime, which was fully supported by the US, ultimately led to the explosion of the 1970s, which we now call the Islamic Revolution. And that is the subject of our next episode, and the last one in the series on Iranian revolutions. Please like this channel, comment, argue, and disagree. Oh yeah, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel, Rebels and Revolutions.